You're a selfish egomaniac who held back better wrestlers for decades. The accusation exploded from Chris Jericho's mouth like a verbal superkick, shattering the professional atmosphere of WWE's executive conference room. Hulk Hogan sat frozen across the mahogany table, his trademark confidence cracking under the assault. What happened in the next 8 seconds would expose wrestling's most carefully guarded secrets about ego, politics, and the price of legendary status. February 14, 2012. WWE Headquarters, Stamford, Connecticut. The fourth-floor boardroom was filled with an electric tension that made even veteran wrestling executives shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. This wasn't a routine creative meeting about upcoming storylines. This was a reckoning between wrestling's biggest ego and its most outspoken critic. Around the polished conference table sat some of the most powerful figures in sports entertainment. Triple H occupied his usual seat as WWE's executive vice president, his expression carefully neutral. Stephanie McMahon sat nearby, her notebook open, but her attention completely focused on the verbal warfare about to unfold. The air crackled with the kind of anticipation that comes before career-defining confrontations. Chris Jericho, the king of the world, sat rigidly in his chair, his usually theatrical demeanor replaced by something much more dangerous. At 41 years old, Y2J had spent over a decade watching wrestling politics from the inside, and what he had seen had filled him with a rage that was finally ready to explode. Across from him sat Hulk Hogan, wrestling's most successful performer, wearing his trademark confident smile that had charmed audiences and manipulated backstage situations for 3 decades. But that smile was about to face its ultimate test. The meeting had been called to discuss potential storylines for WrestleMania 28, specifically exploring whether Hulk Hogan should return for another high-profile match. The conversation had started diplomatically enough, with various creative options being presented and evaluated. But everything changed when Hogan began discussing his philosophy about what made compelling wrestling entertainment. The key to this business, Hogan had said, his voice carrying that familiar theatrical authority, is understanding your value and protecting it. Not every wrestler can be in the main event. Not every performer deserves equal treatment. You have to maintain hierarchies and standards, or the whole system falls apart. Those words hit Chris Jericho like a sledgehammer to the skull, because he recognized them as the justification for every backstage political maneuver, every buried push, every talented wrestler who had been held back to protect established stars' positions. Some wrestlers think they deserve opportunities they haven't earned. Hogan continued, addressing the room with the confidence of someone sharing profound business wisdom. They want main event spots, championship reigns, and top billing without proving they can draw money or connect with mainstream audiences the way proven stars can. The implications were devastating. Hogan was essentially arguing that wrestling success should be determined by established stars' approval rather than talent, innovation, or audience reaction. He was defending the very system that had kept countless deserving wrestlers in secondary roles. The wrestlers who understand the business, Hogan added, his tone suggesting he was revealing industry secrets, are the ones who accept their roles and work within the system, who respect the hierarchy, and don't try to jump ahead of people who have paid their dues and proven their value over decades. Chris Jericho's hands, which had been resting calmly on the conference table, slowly clenched into fists. Every word Hogan spoke felt like a personal attack on every talented wrestler who had been held back by backstage politics and ego protection. The breaking point came when Hogan began discussing the importance of protecting the brand through careful management of who received main event opportunities. Wrestling is a business, not a charity, Hogan said. You can't just give opportunities to everyone who thinks they deserve them. You have to be strategic about who you push and when you push them. Jericho could no longer contain his 15 years of accumulated fury. He stood up slowly from his chair, his 6'0" frame commanding attention, despite being smaller than most main event wrestlers. When he spoke, his voice carried the edge that had made him one of wrestling's most dangerous microphone performers. "Hulk," Jericho said, his tone deceptively calm, but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled rage. "I need to address what you just said about hierarchies, protecting value and strategic pushing." Hogan turned toward Jericho with his practiced diplomatic smile, the expression of someone accustomed to being approached by fellow wrestlers seeking advice or validation. "Sure, Chris. What's on your mind, brother?" The casual use of brother, Milos Hogan's trademark term of false familiarity, pushed Jericho past his carefully maintained professional composure. "What's on my mind?" Jericho said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is that I've spent 15 years watching you use those exact words to justify holding back every wrestler who threatened to be better than you." The conference room went dead silent. Triple H's expression shifted from neutral to intensely interested. Stephanie McMahon's pen stopped moving completely. This was no longer a creative meeting. This was about to become a character assassination. "Chris, I think there might be some misunderstanding," Hogan began, but Jericho cut him off with a gesture that was surprisingly commanding for someone challenging wrestling's biggest legend. "No misunderstanding," Jericho interrupted, his voice rising with passion. "I understand perfectly. You talk about maintaining hierarchies and protecting the brand, but what you really mean is protecting Hulk Hogan's position at the expense of everyone else." Jericho began pacing around the conference table, his energy filling the formal business setting despite the corporate atmosphere. "You want to talk about wrestlers who haven't earned opportunities? Let's talk about all the wrestlers who were better than you but never got the chances they deserved because you made sure they stayed beneath you in the hierarchy." The accusations were specific enough to be devastating but broad enough to encompass decades of suspected political maneuvering. Everyone in the room knew Jericho was referencing real incidents, real careers, real decisions that had shaped wrestling history. "You want to talk about respecting the system?" Jericho continued, his voice gaining momentum. "The system you created was designed to keep you on top regardless of who was more talented, more innovative, or more deserving of main event opportunities." Hogan's face was beginning to show strain under the direct personal assault. His hands, which had been resting diplomatically on the table, were now clenched into fists. "Chris, you're out of line," Hogan said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "I've earned everything I've achieved in this business. I've drawn more money and entertained more people than any wrestler in history. My success speaks for itself." "Your success?" Jericho's voice cracked like a whip. "Let's talk about your success. How much of it came from actual talent, and how much came from making sure nobody else got the opportunities to prove they were better than you?" The personal nature of the attack had escalated beyond typical business disagreements. This was about fundamental character, integrity, and the difference between earned success and protected position. "You know what really disgusts me about your attitude, Hulk?" Jericho said, his voice now carrying the full weight of 15 years of frustration. "It's not just that you're political. Everyone in this business has to be political. It's that you're so delusional about it." Jericho stopped pacing and faced Hogan directly. "You've convinced yourself that all your backstage maneuvering was for the good of the business, when it was really just about making sure nobody ever threatened Hulk Hogan's spot at the top of the card." The silence that followed was profound. Jericho had just accused Hulk Hogan of being delusional about his own motivations, of confusing self-interest with business strategy. In a room full of WWE's executive leadership, this was either professional suicide or the most courageous truth-telling in wrestling history. "You're a selfish egomaniac who held back better wrestlers for decades," Jericho said, delivering his final accusation with absolute conviction. "And the worst part is that you've rewritten history in your own mind to make yourself the hero of every story where you were actually the villain." Hulk Hogan sat perfectly still for exactly 8 seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, hurt, and finally a cold determination that anyone familiar with his career would recognize as dangerous. During those 8 seconds, the entire conference room held its breath, waiting to see how wrestling's most successful performer would respond to being called a selfish egomaniac by one of the industry's most respected talents. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more authority and controlled fury than any shout could have conveyed. Every word was precisely chosen, delivered with the kind of measured intensity that comes from decades of handling both public adoration and private challenges. "Chris," Hogan said, never breaking eye contact, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I am protective of my position. I have made decisions that benefited Hulk Hogan. I have used my influence to maintain my spot at the top of this business." The admission stunned everyone in the room. Hulk Hogan never acknowledged using political influence, never admitted to self-interested decision-making, never confirmed what everyone in wrestling suspected but rarely discussed openly. "But you're wrong about everything else," Hogan continued, his voice growing stronger while remaining completely controlled. "And the fact that you can't see the difference proves that for all your talent and intelligence, you still don't understand what real leadership in this business requires." The power dynamic had shifted completely. Hogan was now controlling the conversation, and Jericho was being forced to listen to a perspective he had never seriously considered. "You think protecting my position was about ego," Hogan said. "You think maintaining hierarchies was about keeping other wrestlers down. But what you don't understand is that someone has to be the foundation that holds up the entire structure." Hogan gestured around the conference room, where WWE's executive team was witnessing an unprecedented exchange about wrestling's power dynamics. "You talk about better wrestlers who deserved opportunities. Better at what? Technical wrestling, mic work, character development, maybe. But better at carrying the responsibility of being the face of an entire industry. That's something completely different." The response was gaining momentum, and Jericho was beginning to realize he might have underestimated the complexity of what he was challenging. "You want to call me a selfish egomaniac?" Hogan asked. "Fine. But ask yourself this. In your 15 years in this business, have you ever had to make decisions that affected thousands of wrestlers' livelihoods? Have you ever had to choose between what was good for individual performers and what was good for the entire industry?" The questions were hitting their mark because Jericho knew the answers, and they weren't flattering to his argument. His own career had been built largely on individual talent and performance, not on industry-wide responsibility or decision-making. "Leadership isn't about giving everyone equal opportunities," Hogan continued. "It's about making the hard choices that keep the entire business successful and growing. Sometimes that means protecting established stars who have proven they can draw money. Sometimes that means saying no to talented wrestlers who aren't ready for the pressure of carrying a company." Hogan leaned forward, his intensity increasing without his voice rising. "You call that selfish. I call it taking responsibility for something bigger than any individual career, including my own." The education was continuing, and Jericho was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the difference between individual talent and industry leadership. "You want to know what the real difference is between us, Chris?" Hogan asked. "You've spent 15 years trying to prove you're better than everyone else. I've spent 30 years making sure there was still a wrestling industry for talented people like you to work in." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Jericho had indeed focused primarily on his own career advancement and recognition, while Hogan's decisions, however self-serving they might have seemed, had occurred within the context of building and maintaining wrestling's mainstream viability. The room remained silent for several more seconds as both men processed what had just happened. Finally, Jericho spoke, his voice much quieter now, almost uncertain. "So you're saying all of your political maneuvering was really about protecting the industry?" he asked. "I'm saying that, when you're at the top, every decision you make affects everyone below you," Hogan replied simply. "You can make those decisions based on what's best for your own ego, or you can make them based on what's best for the business that supports thousands of people. I chose the business." The conversation that followed lasted another 20 minutes, with the initial confrontation evolving into something resembling a seminar on wrestling business philosophy. Hogan explained the reasoning behind specific decisions that Jericho had interpreted as ego protection, while Jericho shared his perspective on how those decisions had affected individual careers and creative opportunities. By the end, what had started as a bitter accusation about selfish ego had become a dialogue about the complexity of leadership in an industry where individual success and collective prosperity were often in tension. "I owe you an apology," Jericho said as their exchange wound down. "What I said about you being a selfish egomaniac was unfair. I may not agree with all your decisions, but I can see that you were trying to balance individual careers with industry stability." Hogan extended his hand, and they shook with what appeared to be genuine mutual respect. "And you've reminded me that leadership requires transparency, not just decision-making. I should have done a better job explaining why certain choices were necessary for the business." The impact of their confrontation was felt throughout WWE's executive structure. Other wrestlers who learned about the exchange began to understand Hogan's past decisions differently, recognizing the difference between ego protection and strategic industry management. The phrase "selfish egomaniac" became a reminder within WWE that challenging established power structures could lead to deeper understanding if both parties were willing to examine the complexity of leadership in entertainment business. 8 seconds of silence had transformed a potentially career-damaging accusation into an opportunity for education about the balance between individual ambition and industry responsibility in professional wrestling. The ripple effects of their boardroom confrontation extended far beyond WWE's corporate headquarters. Within days, word of the exchange had spread throughout the wrestling industry, sparking intense debates about the nature of leadership in sports entertainment and the difficult balance between protecting established stars and promoting new talent. The exchange influenced WWE's approach to talent development, with management recognizing the need to better communicate booking decisions that affected wrestlers' careers. The confrontation became a case study about the complexity of leadership in entertainment industries, where individual success and collective prosperity often created competing priorities.